Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today we're going to be Dockerizing a Django REST framework application. Now, a few things that might be helpful to know before we get started is a basic understanding of Django, Django REST framework, Docker, Docker Compose, and the Linux operating system. For this tutorial, I will be using Poetry as a dependency manager, so if you use something else, some of the steps might be slightly different, but in general it should be about the same. So without any more waiting, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is start the Django project with the Django admin start project command. We're just going to call this tutorial, and we can see what that project looks like. And this is the basic project structure that we get when we run the start project command with Django. And now the next thing we want to do is initialize the Poetry project, and we can do that with Poetry init. We're just going to call it tutorial, keep the version, description, whatever you would like, license, whatever you would, and compatible Python version, whichever Python version you want your project to be compatible with. We'll skip defining dependencies for now. And it looks like our Py project file has been created. Now let's go ahead and add our dependencies. So we need 3 dependencies. We need Django, Django REST framework, and the Scicop G2 dependency, and that's going to allow us to communicate with a Postgres database. Now that we have the dependencies added, we can create a virtual environment using the Poetry install command. And it doesn't look like we are currently activated in our environment. So let's go ahead and get that added. Cool. We can just take this here. And now we should be using the correct environment. And if we ran the server command for Django, we should see that it starts up. And let's go and see if we can see our project. Awesome. So now let's go ahead and create our Docker file. And in here, we're going to build it using the base version of 3.10.4. That's the latest version as of this video. And we're going to use it as base. And we're going to do this build in 2 steps. So the first step, we're going to define our environment variables to install all of our dependencies using Poetry. And the last thing we need is to define the Poetry version. Cool. Now that we have our our environment variables defined, let's copy our poetry.lock and our pyproject.toml file into the current directory. And we can see that we have those files here. And the next thing we want to do is we actually want to install Poetry into our into our Docker image using whichever Poetry version we defined in the environment. And then we will also create a new virtual environment path And what this is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to install the dependencies using Poetry into this virtual environment. And in order to do this, we need to set our path for the virtual environment ahead of our current path. And then finally, we can install the dependencies using Poetry. So that's our initial build, and that gets us through installing the dependencies. And now we can actually install and add the commands to run Django in this container. So what we want to do first is start another step, another build step. So we're going to do from Python 3.10.4 and then slimbuster. Slimbuster is a Debian version of the Python 3 image. It allows you to run package updates and upgrades such as apt-get update and apt-get upgrade. And that will allow us to install two dependencies that we need in order to build scicop G2 binary from source. And now that we've installed those packages, we can define our virtual environment again. And then in this step, we actually want to copy that virtual environment from our base image, which we define starting on line 1 and ending on line 14. And then very similar, we want to add that path ahead of the current path, and that way we have the correct Python environment running in our Docker image. We'll define a work directory. And then finally, we need to copy our source code over. And define an empty command. An alternative to doing this individual copy of files is you can simply do a copy the entire directory into the current working directory in the Docker image. Either one works. It's just a preference. Now that we have that, we can test that our build works. Running the docker build command. Oh, it doesn't look like I have the Docker app running. Let me go ahead and start that. Okay. Looks like we got it working. And let's wait for the build to finish. And we can see if the build works or the image runs correctly by using docker run and mapping the port 8000 to our localhost 9001 and the name of the image, and then finally the command that we want to run. And this one will be slightly different because we want to bind the server to the 000 address. Now that we have it running in the container, we should be able, if we refresh this, it should not work. However, if we go to port 9001, we should be able to see it. And now that we have our Docker container working correctly, we can throw this into a Docker compose file so that it's easier to work with in the future. So go ahead and create a Docker Compose file and open it up. We'll be using the latest version of Docker Compose, which as of this video is 3.9. And we will define our services. Right now we just have one service of API. Give it a container name, a build context, a command, which is the command that we just ran it with. Define some volumes. The only thing that we need to define here is we want to map the current directory to our working directory, and that's going to allow us to live edit the code while the Docker container is running. The next thing we want to define is the port, which was that 9001 mapping to 8000 in the command. And then lastly, we can define some environment variables. And we will add our database credentials to this in a minute. So now if we run Docker Compose build and Docker Compose up, we should be able to access our app on the same port as before. To verify that no container is running, we can refresh and see. And if we run it here, we should be able to refresh and see that we have this running. Perfect. Now the next thing we want to do is add our database container to the Docker Compose file. So let's open it back up and add a database service. So for this, we'll give it a container name of DB, and the image that we'll use is Postgres 14.0, and we'll actually use Alpine 3.14. The reason for using Alpine is just it's a smaller image, should work about the same, but feel free to use whichever you want. If you want to use MySQL, change it with MySQL here. You'll just have to change a few other things in your build. And lastly, we want to define some environment variables so we know the user, password, and DB to use for our Django application. So we will have Postgres user as root, Postgres password as whatever you want. Here we'll just do super strong password because this is just to run locally. You would change this in production. You probably wouldn't have it here. You would probably pull it from something like Secrets Manager so that it wasn't in the environment. Now that we have the database added, we can add those same environment variables up here, and we can call it DB user, DB password, same as before. The database name is the Postgres DB below. The host is the container name. And lastly, the port is the default port for Postgres, which is 5432. And the last thing to do before we can actually run this and have our Django application connect is we need to edit the Django settings. And if we look at our current structure, we can see that it is in tutorial and then settings.py. So let's go ahead and edit that file. And you want to come down where it starts to say databases on line 76. You can see that here. And for this, what we are going to do is we are actually going to have an if statement and say if we have DB name in the environment we are going to have a different definition for our database. And because we are using Postgres, we want to use the PostgreSQL scopg2 engine. The name we'll just get from the environment. Same as the user. Same as password. And port. Now we need to close off our dictionaries. And we can save and write that. And the last thing we want to do is go back to the top of the file here and import OS. And that's because we are using the OS library to pull in those environment variables. So let's save and quit and see if our Django application can connect to the database. Oh, looks like we have an error here. Oh, I see. So we need to edit on line 76, change OS environment to just OS environ. And now we can run it again. And it looks like the authentication failed for user root. So let's see what we did in our Docker compose file here. Oop. That should be the same. Let's see if it connects. No, failed. Let's just change it all to test and see if it works. Interesting. I'm going to clear everything I have in Docker and rebuild this entirely. Okay, so that seemed to work. I'm not sure why. I will do some additional investigation, but it's possible that I defined a separate container called DB, and what happened was that was getting priority over the DB container defined in the Docker compose file for this project. But we have it working now. So the next thing we want to do is actually run migrations in this container. So what we will do is we will split it here using Command D, and we'll go back into the project folder, and in order to run those migrations, we will execute the migrate command. And now we have the migrations applied in our database container that's currently running. The next thing we want to do is close and stop those containers from running. And we want to add the REST framework to the list of installed apps in the Django settings. So open up Django settings again and scroll down to where it says installed apps. Add a new line, and we're just going to add REST framework here. And now in order to actually test our application and our REST API, we want to add a new Django application and create some serializers and views. So to do that, we will run the Django admin start app, and we'll just call this quick start. And in the quick start directory, we can see that we have the basic setup for a Django application, but we want to create a file called serializers. So we will just create and open it in our text editor. And to test this, we'll just grab from the Django user and group model and give that a test. So we want to bring it in from REST framework. And the serializer is responsible for turning JSON and other data types into a workable Python object. So we can have a user serializer. And define the fields that we want to see in our API. And then the one other serializer that we want is a group serializer. Which will be very similar to our previous serializer, except instead of user, it will be for group. And we'll just have URL and name for this one. So save and quit that. The next file we want to edit is our views file, and that will allow us to actually hit the API and create users and groups and things like that. So open up the quick start views file, and we can just get rid of what's in here. And the first thing we want to do is import those models from the Django contrib auth library. And we also want to import view sets. And we want to import permissions, because we are going to block these APIs for non-authenticated users. And we want to import our serializers that we just created. And finally, we will create the view sets. If you're unfamiliar with Django view sets or Django REST framework view sets, I highly recommend taking a look at the documentation for them. It's pretty extensive. But of course, if you have any questions, please leave a comment and I will be happy to answer them. The first thing we'll do is add a query set, which is basically every user in our database. And then which serializer we will use is the user serializer. And then the permission classes is just going to be permissions.isAuthenticated. And basically that's going to allow any authenticated user to use this API. And we can just copy that, come down here, paste it, change this to be group view set, change this to be just all of the groups, and here we will have group serializer, and we will leave the permissions the same. So now that we have the view sets done, we actually need to add routes so that we can hit these view sets with our API client. In order to do that, we will open up the URLs file in our project. And you can see that in the project name urls.py. And what we will do here is we can just get rid of that, and we will include a few things here. We want a router, and from our quick start app we want to import the views, and we will add a default router here. And we want to add a users route, and we want to add a groups route. And finally, we will wire this up. And this API auth part is actually adding the login URLs so that we can have a browsable API. And we will take a look at that after we get done here. Cool. So it looks like we're done with that. Let's save and quit and see if our application runs now. And we will just use Docker compose up. Looks like we have an issue in our URLs file. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Oh, looks like I misspelled patterns here. We can try this again. And it looks like our API is up and running. Let's hop over to our browser and see what that looks like. And since we have the Django REST framework installed, it gives us a nice browsable UI. If we click on one, we get authentication credentials were not provided. We have to log in order to do that. And if we wanted to do that, we can simply create a super user in our Django application through a Docker compose command. In order to do that, we will run docker compose exec. And we want to execute this command using the API container that's running. We already ran the migrate command, so we don't need to do that here. We just want to create a super user. And we'll just prompt it, have it prompt us. Oh, we need to change into the project folder and run that command again. We can just define a username. We'll leave it as root for now. We'll have root@root.com and then some sort of super strong password. And now that we've created the super user, we can hop back over to our browser and log in. And we can see that we can actually access our APIs, both users and groups. And we can create groups as well as users. And if we go back to the user list, we can see both our users in our database. Cool. I think that's it for this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If there are any questions, please leave a comment and I will answer it when I can. And I look forward to the next one.